There we go. All right, let's do it.
So, did everybody have a nice long weekend in August? Was there a holiday in your parts of the country too?
Yeah, it was BC Day in BC.
What does BC Day celebrate?
Apparently, Pride. We had the Pride Parade. That was a big deal. I didn't even know it was happening, but it was.
I think it was called Heritage Day in Alberta. I have to joke that I feel that this holiday was created because otherwise it's July 1st to first weekend of September. They thought that's a really long stretch, maybe not to give us a day off. But growing up, they always called it bank holiday or civic holiday, and now it's Heritage Day or BC Day. What do you call it in Ontario there, Walid?
Not sure, actually.
The day I don't have to go to work. Well, I appreciated it nonetheless. It was a nice day out at the lake, and I didn't get sunburned or eaten by mosquitoes, which are both I consider wins. All right, let's get started. Well, happy Friday, everybody. I'm so glad you joined us for another episode of Off the Record. My name is William, and joining me today are two members of our True North team. You've got Walid, who's based in Montreal, I think, right now, or Montreal/Ottawa. And you've got Alex out in British Columbia. So you've got a pan-Canadian team, and possibly no one from Ontario, which might be a first for us. So we're glad you came to join us. We're going to have a review of some of the exciting news stories, and it wasn't a dull week, even though we're in the middle of summer for news. And we actually had a whole series of immigration stories happen in the past week. Willie, why don't you give us the rundown on what happened with immigration?
Well, yeah, starting with the fact that we don't know what's happening with immigration in the country right now. I mean, our numbers have been frozen since pretty much when Mark Carney took office in terms of our monthly updates on immigration numbers. We do know since the beginning of 2025 that over 800,000 people new immigrants have been admitted into Canada throughout different classes of migration, temporary workers and permanent residents and whatnot. But Michelle Rempler-Garner, Calgary area MP, mentioned and spoke out just yesterday about the fact that the immigration department is no longer updating those numbers monthly, therefore leaving Canadians in the dark about what exactly we're having to deal with in terms of the housing and economic stress that, frankly, the mass migration regime in Canada is causing.
Now, I would never be the first to suggest that the government just wasn't being incompetent when it comes to producing figures. Although you do have to wonder, Alex, do you think that there's possibly a reason why the government is failing to disclose immigration data for the past 5 months?
Well, I don't. I also would be the last one to speculate that the government is incompetent. I think that maybe they just aren't keeping track. But luckily, we all have eyes and ears, so we can kind of do that on their behalf.
Part of me wondered if perhaps, given that they tried to say during the election, during Mark Carney's leadership race, and subsequent to that, that there was going to be a new sheriff in town when it comes to immigration, they're going to undo some of the damage that's done. What makes me wonder if maybe the numbers aren't actually bearing that up, that if the numbers were published, we'd see that it's still the open season on open borders in Canada, and we have millions of immigrants coming into the country. I think in 2024, the number was somewhere around 3 million between permanent and non-permanent immigrants in Canada. And anecdotally, I think a lot of Canadians who live particularly in big cities, still see quite a lot of immigration happening. Waleed, do you believe that that the government has actually made a concerted effort to crack down on immigration, or do you think it's business as usual from the shiny new Carney Liberal government?
I think it's business as usual with maybe perhaps a slightly different rhetorical tone in terms of how they discuss immigration during the election period. Of course, it's become, and poll after poll has shown that the support for immigration levels or immigration overall across multiple classes have consistently declined in Canada. And to get Canadians to feel that way about migration, given the fact that, immigration has been a important part of our modern legacy to grow our population, grow our economy, and perhaps grow our society to an extent, right now it's no longer a popular theme. I mean, today is very much popular in the other direction to be against this mass migration regime. It's very much popular to be in favor of reducing the overall number, to put a moratorium on certain classes of migration, to end certain programs. Of course, temporary workers right now are making up close to 19% of the private sector. And this is happening as students, and we know we talked about this before, students aren't just becoming conservative all of a sudden. Students and young people are not finding jobs, not finding ways to pay off rent, student loans, and being forced to live in their parents' basements. I mean, this was Poilievre's leading tone when it comes to speaking to the youth. So all this is happening because, frankly, it's too much. And I don't think Carney is changing. The evidence shows that he's actually continuing, perhaps even expanding that legacy. Again, in the first 4 months of this year, over 800,000 people were admitted into Canada, new immigrants, that is. So the numbers don't suggest that at all. And of course, as long as that's the case, there's no evidence to suggest that Carney is any different from Trudeau.
And I think one of the concerns Canadians have isn't just the raw numbers. It's the kind of immigrants that are being brought to Canada, they're being allowed in. I think if it were 800,000 doctors, nurses, engineers, people with in-demand degrees, skills, and education, I think we'd be building welcome scans for that level. I think it's because so many of these people are unskilled or don't have skills that the Canadian economy particularly needs. And so the question is, do we really need 800,000 more Uber drivers, DoorDash drivers, and Tim Hortons workers? So, which seems to be where a lot of these temporary foreign workers are ending up. So, Alex, you're out in British Columbia. What's the view from that part of the world?
Well, BC has always been kind of left coast, and so we're generally pretty tolerant of most things generally, and that includes immigration. William, you and I were talking off air just before we started about how, especially when it comes to the news and particularly politics, people tend to have a very short attention span. So to Walid's point, I think it's really difficult to overstate how much Canadians' attitudes have changed about immigration over the last 10 years. People are probably unlikely to remember that during the 2015 federal election debates between Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau, they were both tripping over each other over who would seem more tolerant about bringing in Syrian refugees. And now it seems like Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre are tripping over each other about virtue signaling, I guess you could say, to the Canadian public's demands to reduce or at least bring immigration below the speed limit. So I think that sentiment applies here in BC as well, which is really surprising because, again, we're kind of the most tolerant place in the entire country.
I would certainly say that it would be very hard to divorce politics from immigration policy, that, no politician wants to lose votes. And if you take a really tough stand against immigration, I think there's a worry that you're going to be perceived as intolerant or unwelcoming or against certain ethnic or cultural groups. And politicians hate that. They really do. They don't like losing votes if they can possibly avoid it. Now, in BC or crossing the border, I see a second story there, Walid, that apparently we saw some number of illegal immigrants crammed into a truck and attempt to be smuggled across the border. What's the story there?
So the story here is that we had a border crossing in Quebec that had a cube truck that probably doesn't fit nearly as many people as were found. 44 people, mostly Haitian nationals. Now that's important because Haitian nationals have been flooding into the U.S. previously, given the situation of rather civil or incivility or chaos in Haiti over the last couple of years. The U.S. ended their temporary special status that they offered as well to Venezuelan and a few other nationalities, and they've therefore flooded into Canada as a response. Now, that truck was operated by 3 Turkish nationals who were operating this whole smuggling operation. So I guess the story here is that migrants are smuggling other migrants in, and foreigners are doing dirty work to bring other people into the country. And of course, the RCMP found them in rather concerning condition, dehydrated, not a lot of air inside of there, no proper ventilation. So the conditions that the authorities found these migrants in were absolutely horrific and unfortunate, and it just goes to show exactly the kind of lengths that some people are willing to do to come to Canada, but in other sense, what the lengths that some other people are willing to do to make a couple bucks to smuggle other people in it. I really think this is just one more example among many. Of course, this one being more recent.
Yeah, I did read that the 44 people were not in great condition. There wasn't any water or food, that there was limited air because, of course, a Q van isn't ventilated for human cargo. It's ventilated for pallets of cargo, of inanimate objects being moved across the border. And I think the point you make about the 3 people who engaged in the smuggling, they certainly weren't doing it out of the kindness of their hearts to take these Haitian refugees and have them cross the border. These people often end up in indentured work. They take out loans, or they commit to paying vast amounts of money to these smugglers, and then have to work it off after they get here, sometimes for years. Alex, have you, again, out in British Columbia, where I think Vancouver after Toronto would probably be the second largest destination for immigrants, is smuggling and illegal border crossing a real problem in British Columbia right now?
I don't know if British Columbians are even intolerant enough of migration to require people to be smuggled in illegally like they have to be in Quebec. I just had a friend visit from Alberta, and she said that the Alberta departure gate at YVR was the whitest place she was ever there in BC. So, yeah, it would be hard to tell, who is migrating illegally and who isn't. We tend to have a very, very multi-ethnic place, and again, a very, very accepting province. And so I think a lot of people just fly in and frankly just never leave.
Even for tolerant left coast British Columbia, the issue of affordable housing must sometimes run up against immigration and say, unlimited immigration causes a problem in a place where so few people are already able to afford housing. How does that dynamic play out between, on the side of the supposed progressive left?
Well, there's always been a funny thing going on in BC when it comes to illegal migration and housing, because typically the folks that you would expect to migrate illegally, which would be from the East Indian community, they pack like 100 people into one house. So it becomes difficult to blame them for the housing crisis, given the fact that they're so efficient, I guess you could say, at cramming multitudes of people into single family spaces.
I did see a posting that was advertising, it used to be you could rent a house, and then it was rent a room, and then it went to rent a bed. And the most recent one I saw was rent half a bed, that for, I think it was $900 or $950 a month, you can rent one half of a queen size bed, the other half already being occupied by someone I assume you would become pretty close friends with if you're going to be sharing a queen-size bed with them every night. Do you think we've reached the most absurd level of sharing, or do you think it'll be have an entire bed corner to yourself, or the beds are already full, but sleep under the bed and you can occupy? I do wonder if we've seen the limit, or if it's going to continue getting worse as more and more people enter the country and we're not building the housing to keep up with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, we would only build 250,000 houses per year, and we're bringing in 1 to 3 million people per year by most estimates. So just by the pure law of supply and demand, I imagine, as ridiculous as it sounds, we could actually be in bunk bed territory the next couple of years here.
Well, so people go study submarines to figure out how to pack that many people into a tight space. Now, Alex, I have to say, you made a comment about the Alberta departure gate being the whitest part of BC. I would beg to differ slightly in that. And Walid, I think you even have a video clip that shows maybe that isn't really the case. Do you want to tell us about it?
Well, let's just say, and this is kind of Malcolm's words, Canada doesn't feel like Canada anymore. This is a scene you'd see out of India, but you're seeing it in Calgary instead.
Watch as you see a woman in a brown jacket running alongside the moving shuttle bus, with a massive group of bus users chasing down the bus in an attempt to board it. In response to the scene at the Franklin LRT station, Calgary Transit says in a statement, As soon as we are made aware of a situation, Calgary Transit promptly deploys shuttles to assist customers. In this case, 13 shuttles have been deployed. Transit ambassadors are also on site, helping customers with wayfinding and directing them to the shuttles. During the mad rush to catch a bus, this man says this is something he's seen before.
I'm in my homeland like this.
Yeah. Does it remind you of your homeland? Where's your homeland?
Punjab.
And this is like this?
Yeah.
I have to say that's what went through my mind too, that this is not a scene you particularly see in Canada, but it is a common scene, not just in the Punjab, but in any part of the world that has a lot of crowding and maybe insufficient services to handle it. So this clip is from last year. This is not a new clip. Why do you think it's suddenly resurfaced on Twitter and is suddenly getting the viral attention when this wasn't something that just happened a day or a week ago?
Well, Canadians aren't only concerned of the scale of migration, they're also concerned about the demographics presented to them. Perhaps there's no demographic that bows to the Indian demographic, which perhaps is the largest. And specifically, and I'm going to quote the man from the video, Punjab, a Sikh majority region. When you look at that video, you can clearly see a number of colored turbans across the crowd of people. The man says it feels like his hometown. Well, because that's how it looks like back home. So the fact of the matter is Canadians are not just concerned with the volume of migration and the economic effects. Those are definitely perhaps the more popular and you could say perhaps the politically acceptable or more politically acceptable path to being critical of Canada's current immigration regime. But they're concerned with the cultural differences, and that's perfectly fine. The fact that we are having a lot of people coming from the same places, in this case Punjab, other cases, of course, Alex, where you're from, there's a larger Chinese community. There are perhaps more Arab pockets in Alberta, depending where you are. Every province shares a slightly different immigration demographic based on local language, economic opportunity, and of course, any other possible trends that have happened over the years. So the fact is, when Candace Malcolm says, and many people perhaps echo this sentiment, but Canada doesn't feel like Canada anymore, because it isn't Canadians or native-born Canadians or Canadians of 25 different backgrounds together. It's primarily, and I'll be willing to put money on this, primarily Indian, Southeast Asian members who are causing scenes like that through, frankly, just simply following the way of life that they've had for a little while.
Alex, I think, apart from the numbers, because I think it's hard for any of us to wrap our heads around, when people say, oh, it's 1 million or 2 million or what that means. Is there a general sense, though, that immigration has reached a point or a volume that instead of new immigrants coming here and integrating into Canadian society, they're actually coming here and forming enclaves of their home country here in Canada and holding on to maybe values, traditions, and beliefs that can sometimes even be at odds with what we would think of as being Canadian values or Canadian cultural practices? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that that's definitely the case. I mean, we were saying again off air just before we started. I mean, I grew up in Surrey, and that scene could have been taken out of Surrey Central SkyTrain Station 20 years ago. But the difference is that Surrey is now basically a model for the entire country. Like the whole country is becoming just like Surrey, but worse. Because when I was growing up in Surrey, I mean, we had a large Punjabi diaspora population, but most of the kids spoke perfect English. And they integrated quite well. And, we would all hang out and we kind of shared the same values. But now I think that even though we're saying notwithstanding the numbers, you have to think about the numbers, because if you have this many people coming from one part of the world simultaneously, it makes it actually very difficult for them to integrate into what we would consider traditional Canadian society, because they're not surrounded by Canadians. They're surrounded by people from the Punjab region. And I actually hear a lot of people in that Punjabi diaspora lament the fact that this is happening. They say that they're actually missing the Canada that they knew 20 years ago as well. So I think that everybody's pretty frustrated across the board with what we're seeing, and it's that we're looking more like a melting pot and less like a cultural mosaic.
I mean, I think that's it, or possibly neither. Possibly we're now, it's like you've taken a new ingredient, and instead of chopping it up and having it become part of a dish or adding a unique spice to it, now you've just got a big glob of it that is floating in your soup, to use a pretty unpleasant cooking metaphor for that.
Well, the other thing I think that's important to address too is that, again, this is a numbers issue. That would not have been a news item 1 year ago if the transit infrastructure was able to keep up with the rate of immigration. But of course, the people who administer transit are not responsible for immigration. That's the federal government. And so what we have here is, again, just too many people coming in, and Canada not being able to keep up. The same thing that applies to housing applies here as well.
I think interesting points, and something that True North is always focused on: immigration policy, something the legacy media either ignores or doesn't report on in a fair manner. But that's why we're here, and we will continue to keep focus on this issue as we go forward. Now, moving from Calgary to the other side of the country, there's that nursery rhyme that, if you go down in the woods today, you're in for a big and turns out nasty surprise, at least if you're in Nova Scotia, because you're not allowed to go down into the woods today. You'll be hit with a $25,000 fine. The government of Nova Scotia, in the name of protecting forests from wildfires, has banned people from hiking, camping, fishing, and taking off-road vehicles into the woods. And they've actually even said, don't step foot. They've put up police tape around their woods. They have posted signs. And one fact that I found surprising is that something like 75% of Nova Scotia is covered in forest. So the government has basically now said, three quarters of your province is a no-go zone. And at least to me, I felt shades of COVID when I read this article. I felt the shades of government restriction and government saying, well, you can't be trusted to use the woods and to behave appropriately, so we're just going to bang you. Maybe you'll need a forest permit or something to walk into it, and if you don't have your proof of forest permit, you'll be subject to fines and arrests. So, Walid, what do you think? Reasonable measure or massive curtailing of civil liberties in Nova Scotia?
Absolute government overreach, frankly. And like you said, it definitely echoes the same vibe as COVID, because the fact of the matter, the formula is the same. The formula is this. Safety is a concern, perhaps for some, and others. Of course, wildfires are not good to our environment. Many of them are caused simply by either human error or, in some case, arson attempts. So there definitely has been this underlying narrative that some people can buy into. And by buying into that narrative, it causes this safety first, safety only mindset, which is the fact that, okay, well, there's a risk that perhaps someone can walk in there and cause perhaps a more frequent wave of forest fires, whatever it is, because they're saying it's dry season now and it's really warm. So I don't know if they've put a deadline on this measure when they're going to take it off, if this is like a 2 weeks to flatten the curve kind of situation or not. But rather, what I'm thinking mostly is that any scenario where people are in this state of fear and state of concern over public safety, if that's just an invitation for government intervention, then this is one more like COVID, but not the last. And it's very, very much concerning for the state of civil liberties in this country.
Alex, what are your thoughts on Nova Scotia's, some would say, draconian action?
Well, I think that one of the things that makes this so COVID-19 adjacent is one of Jeff Evely, who's another friend of the show. He posted a video on X recently where he showed that on one side of the woods, it's considered the woods, and if you walk there, you're subject to a $25,000 fine. But on the other side, it's not considered the woods, and it's completely arbitrary and performative. And so that reminds me a lot of the days when you had to wear a mask when you walked into a restaurant, but then as soon as you sat down, you were able to take the mask off, right? I don't think that people even mind so much these government restrictions because they're somewhat well-intentioned. Like Walid was saying, nobody likes forest fires, but when it ventures into this performative nonsense where it's just nonsensical, at that point, people have every right to become skeptical and in some cases outraged. I also find it particularly cruel for this to be happening in Nova Scotia. I don't know if you guys have been to Nova Scotia, but going into the woods and fishing is pretty much all there is to do. Like, it's not really a place where you could have many alternative options for fun. And so I think that this would be far more tolerable in a place like Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver. But in Nova Scotia, I think it's just plain cruel because there's basically nothing else to do.
Just to add to Alex, and this is what's so wrong about these one size fits all solutions and this top down government authoritative nature, which is the fact that, I mean, for example, in COVID, a lockdown wouldn't affect a young programmer working from home who already lives at his parents' place, in a comfortable financial situation. Frankly, it's a bit advantageous for some people. But a lockdown for someone that is dealing with, mental health issues, that is already facing severe social isolation, and whose livelihood depends on being outside and engaging with people, significant. So what I'm trying to say here is that for Nova Scotians, because I'm not a Nova Scotian, I haven't been to Nova Scotia, I have been to the woods in a very long time, and so all of those things would put me in a position where I would be much less sympathetic to the lifestyle and nature that people out there, are facing. Of course, perhaps there are a few more things to do than visit the woods in Nova Scotia, but my point here is that a lot of people will simply lack sympathy because they lack understanding. And I think that that's probably the issue with a lot of Canadians outside of Nova Scotia who might be very much supportive of the measure. Perhaps what they appreciate and what Nova Scotians appreciate are two different things, and simply that's why they wouldn't mind seeing those restrictions be put on themselves. But that's why government, one-size-fits-all solutions don't work, because people have different needs and different lifestyles and cultures and livelihoods, and therefore I think this is very devastating for people that live in Nova Scotia, people that live in rural areas. Cub Scouts, I used to do Cub Scouts, so going to the woods, hiking, these activities are very much part of the culture over there and across the country, frankly. So it's sad to see.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, Walid. And anytime you have these extreme measures, you're always going to have winners and losers. So I'd be really curious to see what happens in Nova Scotia in terms of the indoor 24-hour fitness industry. This might be an opportunity for them to recoup some of their losses during COVID. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting point as well.
I'm now thinking that we have to produce a new series called Walid in the Woods, and have him report from different wooded areas. And if that's something you'd like to see, make sure you respond on our socials and share that with our team. I guess the other thing that really leapt out at me was a $25,000 fine for wandering in the woods to have a bit of summer fun of fishing or hiking. I don't even think we charge $25,000 for serious assault in this country as a punishment. But yet, you take out your walking stick, and that's a $25,000 fine. Does that seem a little excessive to anybody else in this case?
Oh, it's completely excessive. That actually, I think, brings us to our next story. It's a perfect segue because I think we were going to talk about stranger attacks in Vancouver. And in this recent story in Vancouver, I kid you not, the guy's bail release order the last time he was in court, I think, was $100 for a similar stranger attack. So you're right. I mean, it's a what would the math on that be? A 2,500% greater fine for wandering in the woods in Nova Scotia than it is for randomly attacking a tourist in downtown Vancouver. Gives you an idea of the kind of topsy-turvy, bizarro world Canada lives in right now.
Yeah, you do have to think, it was fine when all he did was assault strangers, but then he ran into the woods to escape. And that's when he really crossed the line, and we had to do something. Now, Alex, again, as a Vancouver person, this isn't the first time we've seen a random stranger just get attacked for no apparent reason. What do you think's happening out there in Vancouver?
Well, we just have a ridiculous revolving door justice system. So I had done an article on behalf of True North Wire just a few months ago about a fella named Hugh Mason, I believe, in Surrey, if my memory serves me correctly. And I think he's had 42 court appearances in the last 2 years. So basically what we do is we just, we take $100 as like their bail, and we just throw them back on the streets, and we hope for the best. Our other friend of the show, Clayton Domain, was pointing out recently that one of the most absurd things about our criminal justice system is that the punishment for breaching your probation, and in the case of a stranger attack, is more probation. So it's no surprise that these people just continue to reoffend, given the fact that the consequences are basically nil. until they do something incredibly horrific, in which case it becomes a serious indictable offense like a murder.
You do have to wonder if someone has committed multiple assaults in the past. How shocked can you be that they then go out and commit another assault? Now, Walid, in this case, it was a tourist again who was assaulted. Do you think Vancouver is starting to get a reputation as an unsafe city, as a city where tourists should avoid, given the level of random violence that seems to be happening there on a pretty regular basis now?
Well, frankly, I think you have to put it in context across the country. I mean, Toronto and Montreal are also major tourist destinations, but I think what puts Vancouver apart is that drug situation out there. I mean, I went to Vancouver only once in my life, and that was a 4-day trip, and I saw 2 overdoses happen in 2 days, Friday and a Saturday on a weekend trip. So the fact of the matter is, Vancouver is perhaps its provincial government, its social cultural approach of being progressive and accepting to everything and anything means that, frankly, that it isn't the safest destination. It can be much cleaner, much safer, much more organized, but they choose not to because I guess that's the kind of their contribution to civil liberties is keeping criminals on the streets. So it's unfortunate to see, but it was very, very much a beautiful city. But I think it's too much of a slap on the wrist. And to tie it back to the comment, because I think it was a perfect segue from the Nova Scotia story, is I think our politicians in Canada know how to deter Canadians from doing things, but they don't know how to deter Canadians from doing crimes. They know how to deter Canadians from having fun. $25,000 is a pretty strong deterrence, but they don't know how to deter people from committing crimes because, $100 bail after bail after bail, probation, house arrest, keeping these dangerous people that are committing violent offenses in open society. It's simply an approach that's not working.
It is interesting to think if there's, the criminal justice system is largely federal, but things like enforcement of drug policy or homelessness, vagrancy tends to be more of a provincial thing. And you're wondering if it's becoming, the combination of those two things together that's destroying what is one of the world's most beautiful cities. That there is no doubt that Vancouver, between the ocean and the mountains, and the fact that there were rules to make buildings have a certain look and feel to it, that it's a gorgeous city. And it is sad to think that it's almost rotting from the inside with some of these bad government policies.
Well, yeah, a lot of people like to think that the court system is run provincially, and it is. But what people don't realize at the same time is that amendments to the criminal code, which includes bail policy, is again determined by the federal government. So Vancouver has, and it's not unique to Vancouver, this is generally a big West Coast problem. You have similar issues in Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. And I think the reason for that is that the West Coast just attracts, forgive me for using this politically incorrect term, I think it is politically incorrect these days, but crazy people. I think what happens with the West Coast is a lot of people are just escaping their problems. So they go west and then they hit the ocean and there's just nowhere else to go. So they kind of settle there. I think the same thing applies to Vancouver. But the problem is that Vancouver has to, the judges in Vancouver have to operate according to the bail procedures and the criminal code amendments that are established by the federal government. And the people in the federal government in Ottawa might not necessarily be privy or understanding as they should be about the situation on the ground where we are. And so they might say, well, we should give more lenient sentencing to violent offenders out of a place of compassion, thinking that everywhere is like wherever their riding happens to be. But of course, Vancouver is a different fish entirely.
Definitely an interesting combination of I think shows the power of government policy to create outcomes both good and all too frequently bad. So we're coming to the end, and I have to laugh. This news story is just such a Canadian one in so many ways. But Prime Minister Mark Carney was in Vancouver enjoying the Vancouver Pride Festival. And while he was there, he took some photos with Pride attendees. And one photo in particular, which I should say is a little bit viewer discretion advised, we have blurred it to try and minimize the offense of it, was with this gentleman who was wearing not very much as a Pride outfit. And you have to think, why did Prime Minister Mark Carney decide, out of everybody at Pride, this was the man he wanted to embrace. And I do laugh because at first, a lot of people thought this was artificial intelligence, that there's no possible way that Prime Minister Mark Carney is hugging a man wearing a bright pink thong that is showing off his bare buttocks. But I can assure you, this is a Reuters photo taken and now licensed by Reuters for use in other publications. So to me, my opinion is this shows the kind of identity crisis happening at Pride parades, because people have very different ideas about what Pride is and what it should be and what its role is. And you've got on one side the people saying Pride is for everybody. It's a family-friendly event. It's sponsored by banks and airlines and cell phone companies who have, kindly rainbowed their logo for June, for Pride Month, or for the parade. And then on the other side, you've got, well, no, Pride is meant to be kind of a rebellion. It's meant to be a rejection of restrictive society that for a long time held back gay and lesbian people from living their real lives, their true lives. And so therefore, it's a time for outrageous, shocking, provocative behavior. I think the problem is those two things are deeply incompatible with each other. A family takes their two young kids to Pride to say, look how tolerant, look how diverse, look how this is celebrated in Canada, and then a man with his bottom hanging out of a thong just happens to walk by and is hugged by the Prime Minister. So these are surprising things. Sheldon, what do you think on this Pride issue and on this in particular photo that the Prime Minister took?
I think he should use it as the cover for his next book, Values Too. But I actually find those observations about Pride really, really insightful, because there does appear to be two sort of competing concepts of what Pride is supposed to be. And growing up in Vancouver, the Pride Parade has been around as long as I've been alive. And when I was a kid, I always thought of Pride as sort of a place where, a gay or a lesbian individual might take their nieces and nephews, to show them that this is an acceptable way of life and that, this is just family values, right? I mean, we've all kind of grown to accept that now to some extent. But then over time, it just started to become more fetishized and more obscene, frankly. And so that's how you end up with these situations, as you've noted, where you have kids walking down the street and then, naked men walking next to them. And I don't think that those two things are compatible. I think that the only way that they can really remedy this situation at this point is either A, enforce the law and say you can't walk around naked, or B, you have to have two separate events. You have to have a family-friendly Pride parade and then maybe an adult-only Pride parade, after midnight in a very specific location. Because otherwise these things are just going to keep happening. And I don't really think it's appropriate. And I don't really think that it's actually doing anything positive for the gay and lesbian community either, because they're being associated with what I consider to be kind of degenerate behavior by a certain segment of the Pride parade population.
That was a lot of P's. I'm impressed by your alliteration there, Alex. Now, Walid, this was also not the only controversial thing to happen at one of the summer's Pride celebrations. In this case, it was the Prime Minister hugging a naked man or a near naked man, and that could be construed as inappropriate, but also comical, the fact that the leader of our country is taking this photo. But we've also seen Pride become increasingly disrupted by the pro-Palestinian movement, by those who oppose the war in Gaza, by Black Lives Matter, by trans rights organizations. And Pride, in fact, is getting canceled in a lot of places because these warring factions just seem to be at each other's throats rather than, figuring out a way to put on what is, frankly, not that difficult a task. It's a parade. You walk down a street and you wave at people. So what do you think? Are we at a point where maybe Pride parades are going to go away just because they can't seem to even get along with themselves anymore?
I think there maybe are two or more factions in this community and this parade in particular. And of course, I'm still confused as the fact as why is there's a major parade happening in August. I thought, I was born in June. I was always told that my month was Pride Month and I had to live up with that. But now it's, July and August, we're seeing parades across the country. No issue with it whatsoever. But again, the matter here is that there is very different factions, whether it's a generational divide of people that are, let's say a classic Pride mindset of tolerance of different sexual identities and orientations and lifestyles, and having a bit more of a family friendly event to commemorate that sentiment, or what I think is happening, which is Pride is kind of setting itself into kind of a rebellion movement that is always transforming depending on the issue of the day. Of course, for the last 2 years, the issues in the Middle East have been of high interest. Perhaps in the past, Black Lives Matter and other kinds of social issues as well. So whatever is on the table is something that Pride can try to attempt to deal with or to write off. I mean, I know people that are very much pro-Palestine as can be, but not very much fun with this because there ain't no pride in Palestine, there ain't no pride in the Middle East, and frankly, there won't be as long as that's the face of Pride. And this is another issue that I have with this ongoing situation of Pride becoming more and more ridiculous. Some of the scenes of naked men, naked people, that's the attack angle that people have that is very hard to disrupt or very hard to reject. I mean, when you're seeing people expose themselves in public in front of children, in front of families, that draws the line for many people. That crosses the line that people draw in many cases, and that's a very normal thing. I mean, it's very critical for children to be away from those kinds of scenes. And of course, when you're bringing people under the guise of a family-friendly event while having those scenes coexist, it doesn't work out well for the representation of the Pride movement. And this goes hand in hand with Canada's immigration issue as well. I mean, as we're seeing more and more immigrants pour in from primarily conservative, religious, Muslim, Southeast Asian countries and societies, while seeing the scenes of Pride getting more and more ridiculous, I think the trend today is taking Canada at least to much more potentially homophobic future. I mean, really, if this is the kind of things that people are being introduced to in general society, and these are the kinds of populations we're seeing increase exponentially, then I don't see where the social formula continues. I mean, the reason why Pride exists in Canada, the reason why we have tremendous civil liberty in the social, sexual sphere, is not because we have a rock solid constitution or we have the best laws in terms of freedom. It's because we have a very tolerant society. But the society is made up of those people, and as long as the people keep changing and the Pride movements keep moving further and further to the extremes of every issue they can, I think it creates a formula for disaster in the future where people might feel like they have to go back in the closet in certain areas of the country or in certain environments or certain times of the year. And I think it's rather unfortunate because there is pride to say we're a free country, but I don't think there's pride to say that we're half naked and all these other nonsensical items.
I mean, I had to pick up on one comment you made there of the divisions happening in Pride. One of the groups that keeps getting uninvited are Jewish groups from Pride. They don't want. I think it was Montreal just was forced to re-invite them after outrage. The Jewish groups were being excluded from their Pride. And of course, you are wrong about one thing there, Walid, in that there's no Pride in the Middle East. Well, there's exactly one country in the Middle East that has a Pride parade, and that would be Israel. So I hope irony's on the menu for those groups who try and exclude from Pride based on Middle Eastern politics when there's only one country in the region that has protections, moral protections for gay and lesbian people. So, well, I think that takes us to the end of our episode there. It's been a busy week. I want to thank my friends Alex and Walid for being part of today's episode. Neither of you live in Nova Scotia, so of course you're free to go out and enjoy the woods this weekend, if you will. Bring bear spray if necessary, and be aware. But enjoy some of the civil liberties that still exist in your parts of the world. And of course, for you, thank you for watching. And remember, everything we've said is off the record. I was actually just in the woods. With my family, we do annual, all of the children from the little cabins around this one lake in west of Edmonton do a games weekend. And it's fun to watch, the children 4, 5, and 6 do the relay race or do the potato bag sack jump, or the one event that ended sadly in tragedy was the tug of war, where there's one for kids and then there's one for all ages. And in the all ages one, on one particularly big heave, the rope just broke right in the middle. So that was that was a painful sit down for quite a lot of people who were tugging on that rope.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, especially people with, like, as Walid was saying, people with mental health issues. I mean, like they say that you're supposed to go for a walk through the woods. It's one of the best things that you can do for your brain. So I again think that this is just incredibly cruel. I feel a little bad saying there's nothing else to do in Nova Scotia. I imagine we'll get some angry YouTube comments about that. But
Yeah,
there are other things to do in Nova Scotia, but when 75% of your province is covered in forest, be in the forest is at least one of the things that we have to do. And I still am going to pitch to the board having Walid in the woods as
I would love that.
as the show.
Yeah. I guess the best I can do for now is a virtual background, but I to be fair, from the show, I was just very interested with the fact that this happened so suddenly. I mean, I don't know if there was a kind of the Nova Scotia thing. I don't know if there was some previous measures taken, or if it was just like a hammer right away. I mean, I haven't heard anything similar to this before until this happened, and this is significant, right? So
I read they tried it. They got away with it 2 years ago. So that also shows the danger if you don't fight for your freedoms when they're first taken away. It gives government permission to do it again and again. So that's an important lesson for all of us.
Well, it's also a slow period in the news cycle, right? So the perpetually outraged folks just latch on to stories like this. Like, let's be honest here. Most of the people complaining about this either don't live in Nova Scotia, or even if they do live in Nova Scotia, they probably weren't avid hikers anyway. It kind of reminds me of when COVID first happened. I live across the street from a basketball court, and I never saw kids play basketball. And then when they banned playing basketball, all of a sudden the court was full. So it was like this fascinating lesson in reverse psychology. People just love, wanting to do the things that they can't do.
You don't know what you've got till it's gone.
That's right.
that is human nature for sure. That is definitely human nature.